Okay, welcome back to part two. Let me just make sure it looks like it's okay. Looks like it should be working. Okay, so we just finished recruitment, right? So right now we're at data analysis and specifically cleaning up the data. So what happens is I think we got 225 responses on Qualtrics, and I downloaded it to a software called SPSS, which stands for the Statistical Package for the Social Sciences, and it's basically a data analysis software. It's extremely expensive and extremely cheap for college students. So I think it costs like $2,000 a year or something for normal people, and for a college student, you can get it for like $30 for 6 months. So yes, that's awesome. But when you first download the responses from Qualtrics into SPSS, it's really messy. Um, Here's an example. You just have a bunch of numbers, and you have to go through and clean it up. So this involves naming variables, deleting irrelevant information, just sorting through it to make sure it's uh it's clean and easy to see. And then what you do is you check for unusable data and you throw it out. So I mentioned that we had 225 responses to start out with, but 67 of those we had to throw out because they didn't complete the survey. Um, and that's just unfortunate, and we hate that in research, but that's just how it is. So these were people who maybe completed like 5% of it. They did the demographic questions at the beginning, but then they just exited out, or they maybe just clicked through to submit it, and to get the incentive, the chance to win a gift card is what we used. And yeah, so whatever reason they didn't complete the survey, so we had to throw them out because they didn't have any data to use. There was a particular participant who, for his aught self or her aught self, they described one of the words they used was textbook, and another word they used was memorization. And so that what they're saying is I ought to be a textbook, or I ought to be a memorization. And that just doesn't make sense, right? So we threw that data out. Maybe that person just didn't care, or maybe they didn't understand. Either way, their data is probably not reliable, so we throw it out. Then we had 14 people who we removed because they failed attention checks. There are some people who, when they take a survey, they just click through, and that makes sense. The most motivated people about this whole project would be the researchers themselves, right? And a lot of times the participants, what's motivating them is not the desire to contribute to psychological science, but the desire to get the incentive at the end, or maybe it's class credit or things like that. So some people aren't paying attention and they're just clicking numbers or clicking options. And there's a way to check for this. And what we do for attention checks is every once in a while, there's a question that'll say something like, please select this answer. And if you select that answer, that means you read the question. If you didn't select the answer, then odds are that you weren't paying attention. And we had a specific question that basically said, please select describes me completely. And if someone did not select that, then we're like, maybe they weren't paying attention. So we threw out their data as well. So there were 14 people who didn't pass the attention check. So yeah, removing a lot of data, making sure that we have reliable numbers that we can use. And once it's cleaned up, we go to scoring. And every scale has its own scoring, and we don't make up the scoring. It's made up by the researchers who initially created the scale. For example, for negative affect, to score that, we basically added up all the numbers. So the scores ranged from 10 to 50. For the perceived stress scale, it's well, actually, let me skip that for a minute. For the ideal self, or for the self discrepancy index, like we talked about before, it's a number between 1 and 5, and it's an average. So instead of adding them up, you average the scores. For the perceived stress scale, you add them up, but it's reverse coded. And let me explain reverse coding because it's all over different scales. For example, I have this example on the screen here. The first question says, how often have you felt nervous or stressed? That is a negatively stated question, meaning that higher numbers would indicate higher levels of stress. But the next question is, how often have you felt that things were going your way? That's positively worded, which means that higher numbers would mean less stress. So in one sense, the first question, if you score 4, then you're very stressed. But on the next question, if you score 4, you're very much not stressed. And then that just makes it so your numbers don't mean anything. So what we do is we reverse code it, where we flip one of the um, one of the scales. So what happened was, for the normal ones, for the negatively stated questions, 4 meant you had a lot of stress. You selected very often. But for the reverse coded ones, we flipped it so that if you selected very often, you would get 0. And if you selected never, you would get 4, which means that anytime you score a 4, that always means that you have higher levels of perceived stress. And a 0 always means that you have low levels of perceived stress. So that's the idea behind reverse coding. And there's some psychometric reasons why you want to do reverse coding, which is beyond the scope of this class, but many scales use it, and something to keep in mind. You may recall for this class, I'm not sure how long ago, you would have done different Excel sheets that are found in files on Canvas, where you answer the questions and it automatically gives you a score, right? That scoring was just automatic. It was coded in there so that you wouldn't have to do the scoring. And some of those are reverse coded. If any of you, I can't remember which ones are reverse coded. I can't remember which ones are on there, but yeah, so some of them are reverse coded, some of them are scored differently, but yeah, that's the nature of how psychological measurement works in that sense. Okay, so let's talk about the results a little bit. So I want to, and here's a chance for you to pause the video after I explain this to think through this. For age, I asked participants to give their age, and I gave them an option to select between 18 and 30. And if they were older than 30, I just had an option for 31 plus. And the reason why was because I was mainly sampling college students, so I wasn't too worried about people over 30, but just in case, I decided to put in that 31 plus because I didn't want to exclude anybody. We wanted all the people we can get. So that's why I said 18 to 31 plus. Turns out that several people selected 31 plus, and not too many, maybe 5 or 6, but a few people did. It turns out, and I didn't realize this at the time, but it turns out that I can't report the average, meaning the measure of central tendency, as the mean. Now, when we talk about average, sometimes it's always meaning the mean. Average just means the center. So you can measure the average using the median or the mode or the mean. There are different measures of average, different measures of central tendency. It turns out that because I had several people who selected 31 plus, I cannot use the mean to report as the center. And my question is why? Why is that? And after you know why, think about what's a possible solution to that problem. So pause the video and give that some thought. And the answer is that the mean takes up all the scores. How you calculate the mean is you add up all the scores and you divide it by the number of cases. But because I don't know how old those people are that are over 30, I would have no idea what numbers to add into that equation, if that makes sense. For example, if all of those people were 32 years old, the total mean would be substantially different than if all of those people were 95. Those would be outliers. It would skew the data. So it's no longer a normal distribution. A good solution to that is using a measure like the median, which is what we used. The median isn't, it's not going to matter. It's looking for a middle number, and it's not skewed by outliers, substantially at least. And it's not skewed by any sort of number that's on the edge, on the periphery, like these older 31 plus people. So it wouldn't have mattered. And so that's why we used the median. And that's how we were able to resolve this demographics issue. And I do want to say hitting road bumps is normal in research. And what you do is you just find a way around it and deal with it and move forward. For example, we initially were planning on controlling for trauma. So we had a trauma survey that we gave them. It was found in the DSM-5. Basically, we wanted to see because trauma could have a major impact. It can be a confound variable that could skew results. But Qualtrics coded it wrong, or maybe I put it in wrong, or something like that, and it was unusable. So we just had to throw it out, which wasn't planned for. But that's what happens, and you just move forward with it, right? So hitting road bumps in research is a normal thing. So there's that. Okay, so here are part of the results. To find out moderation, or at least to find variables that moderate the relationship between self-discrepancy and negative affect and perceived stress, you have to make sure that there is a relationship first between self-discrepancy and negative affect and perceived stress. Otherwise, there would be no relationship for the moderator to moderate, if that makes sense. So as a reminder, a correlation is the statistical relationship between two variables. And a positive correlation is when both variables move together in the same direction. When one goes up, the other goes up. When one goes down, the other goes down. That's a positive correlation. A negative correlation is when variables move inverse of each other. So when one variable goes up, the other variable goes down, and vice versa. Cohen, if you recall, gave 3 numbers to stand as to serve as a benchmark for interpreting correlations as small, medium, or large. So a correlation around 0.2 would be considered a small correlation. A correlation around 0.5 would be considered a moderate correlation, and 0.8 would be considered large, and that's loose. You can't say like, well, it's 0.78, so it doesn't reach the 0.8 mark. Those are just rough standards, and it was just his interpretation, and it's kind of what we've adopted in the field. So by the looks of it, if you look at this correlation matrix here, and it's what I've highlighted, ideal self-discrepancy is significantly correlated with negative affect and perceived stress. Perceived stress is PSS, negative affect is NA. And according to Cohen, they would be smaller correlations, around 0.2, 0.3. But I would mention that because in the social sciences, there are so many variables when you deal with humans, it's more common to see smaller correlations. We're not in a lab working with chemicals that we can manipulate. We are working with people behind ethical standards, and people are complex, and there are so many variables. So to expect large correlations just doesn't make sense in psychology or any social science. So a correlation between a correlation of 0.2, 0.3 is still pretty good. But yes, according to Cohen, he would consider that to be small. And remember that correlations can run all the way up to 1. So a 0 correlation means there's no correlation at all, and a 1 means perfect correlation. It's a perfect line, with no deviance whatsoever. So, or deviation, I guess is the word. And then you'll notice for self-discrepancy and the outcomes, it's not significantly correlated. They're small correlations, which is why instead of running 52 hypotheses, we only ran 26, because on the one hand, we did find a relationship between ideal self-discrepancy and negative affect and perceived stress, but not between self-discrepancy and those outcomes. So that basically cuts our hypothesis tests in half. We only have to run half of them because in this case right here, there is no relationship for the moderators to moderate. So that was the case here. But I do want to mention that there could have been a possible type 2 error. And if you recall, a type 1 error is a false positive, and a type 2 error is a false negative. It's a missed opportunity. And we often, I think the world became much more knowledgeable about false positives and false negatives because of COVID testing. So we're all familiar with this. We are more tolerant of false positive, in research, we are more tolerant of false negatives than false positives, because we would much rather say that, okay, there wasn't a finding, and accidentally miss it, than saying something is true when it really isn't. In COVID testing, we would much rather have a false positive than a false negative, because false positive means you quarantine, and just in case, will keep you in quarantine. So it's inverse there, but in psychological research, we're much more tolerant of a type 2 error than a type 1 error. And you may have talked about, well, you did talk about type 1 and type 2 error in class. Here is a basic understanding, hopefully, of this in practice and how it relates to this study that I'm showing you. So if you've taken a statistics class, you've talked about the p-value, the magic p-value. P-value is a percentage chance of a type 1 error. So in research, as long as we have less than a 5% chance of a type 1 error or less than a 5% p-value, then we're okay. We're saying, okay, there's enough chance that this is really a true finding that we're okay. We're gonna call it such. So here, the top numbers that I've highlighted, you have 0.002 and 0.004, which is a 99.8% chance and a 99.6% chance that our finding is accurate, which is pretty high, right? So there's only a 0.002% or a 0.2% chance and a 0.4% chance of getting type 1 errors in those cases, and that's such a small chance that we're okay with that. And generally, like I said, we need to be 95% confident, which is interesting to think about. In science, everything is based on probability. So when we say we know this and we know that, remember that we're always dealing with uncertainties. We know this, or really means we are 95% certain. So yes, we know this. And that's a very simplistic way to say this because then you have replications and many other things. But that's the idea. A false negative is a function of sample size and effect size. And don't overcomplicate it. Really what this means is that when you have a larger sample size, you can detect smaller effects. So what you do is you do this thing called a power analysis, and power is the ability to detect an effect. The opposite of power is a type 2 error. So what I have circled here on this picture is 0.41 power, which means that I had in my study for those correlations a 60% chance of making a type 2 error, a 60% chance of having a missed opportunity, which means this relationship between not self-discrepancy and negative affect and perceived stress, there's a 60% chance that that actually there was a relationship there. We just missed it. So that's a limitation to consider. How could I have avoided this? I could have had a larger sample. That's really the big thing. So yeah, that's a type 2 error. Yeah, that's probably about as much as I'll go there. So here's the demographic data for for this study. Just go ahead and pause it and look through this. I'm not going to spend time here, but just go through this and just think about what do you observe. Get to know the sample. Once you've done that, go ahead and pause the video here and analyze this. And what I'll tell you after you've done that is all the p-values, and you may be wondering what, and these sometimes can be hard to read, and CI is confidence interval and B is a beta, what's it called? I can't remember. But basically they're statistical terms that are outside the scope of this class. But the p-value is what I want to talk about because none of those are below 0.05, which means there's a higher likelihood of a type 1 error, which means we can't accept it, which means I failed to support my hypotheses with this data, which stinks. That's not what we want in research, but that's how it works. So my question for you, and pause the video and think about this for a minute. Why do you think that these moderators aren't significant? Why did I get null findings? And as a follow-up question to that, what would you test instead? Given that these aren't true findings, what would you test instead? So pause the video and think about that for a minute. When you're done with that, I should mention that I was powered to see about a third of the tests at their effect sizes. meaning that 9 of them were underpowered. I did not have a large enough sample. So that's something to consider. Now, those effect sizes may have been so small anyways that it wouldn't have been clinically significant, which means, yes, it could have been statistically significant. It could have been below 0.05, but it could have still been so small that it wouldn't really matter in practice. It wouldn't change the world. So that's something to consider as well. So yeah, there's the results for that. And that was part 1. Part 2, I asked 2 qualitative questions. And if you remember, there's a difference between qualitative and quantitative research. Quantitative yields numerical data. What you do is you take an abstract construct, such as hope or optimism, in my case, and you turn it into a number. You look at, this person, participant so-and-so has a hope number of 40. And what you do is you run statistical tests with those numbers to draw conclusions, and then you take those numerical conclusions and you convert them back into words to make sense of the data. That's quantitative research. Qualitative research, there's no numerical data. The data are words and interviews and things like that, or observations. They're not numerical. So there's a different way to analyze the data. So these are 2 questions, and we'll talk about how I analyzed it. But these are the 2 questions that I asked. And what I want you to do is I'm going to read these, and I want you to analyze this using the 5 points of Brusso. And as a review, Brusso stands for brief, relevant, unambiguous, specific, and objective. So as I read these questions, listen to me read them, then pause the video and analyze my questions. How did I do with Brusso? Where could I have improved? Was it good enough? Yeah, so think about that as I read. Question 1. Your responses indicate that, to at least some degree, there is a discrepancy, a difference, between who you actually are and who you would ideally like to be or feel like you ought to be. Some people might feel strong emotions about this. In fact, there could be a wide range of feelings that a person may have when they think about this discrepancy. Using at least 20 words, please describe how you feel about your discrepancy. Question 2. If you don't feel negative feelings about your discrepancy, why is that? If you do feel negative feelings about your discrepancy, why is that? Please answer using at least 20 words. Again, Brusso is brief, relevant, unambiguous, specific, and objective. So go ahead and pause the video and analyze it. Okay. So, like I said, the data is not numerical. They're in the form of words. So here's the data. This is a screenshot, and these are sentences that people wrote, over 20 words, right? And the specific technique that we used is called thematic analysis, which means we basically pull out common factors, common themes out of the data. So how we did this is we had 4 research assistants who met many times, and they read through all the questions, and this took them hours. And they basically pulled out common factors, common denominators in each of the answers. And for question 1, they found 18 what we called codes, 18 common ideas. And question 2, we had 23 common ideas. And then we took those codes and combined those into themes. And these are the overall themes that we extracted from the data. For question 1, which, if you recall, asked how people generally felt about the discrepancy that they had. People felt hope, acceptance, demoralized, apathetic, and anxious. Question 2 was really what we were looking for, which was a qualitative way to look for moderators, which is, if you feel negative feelings, why is that? And if you don't, why is that? So for those who do feel negative feelings, they say the reason why they feel negative feelings about their self-discrepancy is because of social comparison, comparing themselves with others, self-criticism, that should say self-criticism, and hopelessness. And on the flip side, if they don't feel negative feelings, it's because of hope, or feelings of self-compassion, or just the feeling of apathy, like, I don't really care. So those are the themes that we extracted. And there's a statistical way to double check this, and this is called inter-rater reliability And we didn't go over this in class this morning. We didn't have time. But it'll be important to mention now. What we did is we had 2 independent research assistants who rated the theme. So they're independent from the original team of 4 that did the work in the first place to analyze the qualitative data. And these independent research assistants, they went through each response and basically double checked. So they said, okay, question 1 would correspond with this, or sorry, response 1 would correspond with the theme of hope, or response 2 would correspond with both self-compassion and apathy. And they just went through. And then we had Rater 1 and Rater 2 do this. And we had to check. And we ran a statistical test called Cohen's Kappa to see how much they agreed. And if they didn't agree sufficiently, then they had to redo it. And they had to talk it out. And they had to do this 3 times to make sure we had inter-rater reliability, reliability or consistency between the 2 raters. And it took them 3 times to be able to agree. And this is really just a quality check to make sure the themes are what they are supposed to be, if they're robust enough. And you'll notice the numbers here, and all of them are above 0.7 with the acceptance of 1, which is acceptance, that's 0.63. Anything above a 7 will indicate a sufficient amount of agreement. So that's kind of where we were. And that was a result of our qualitative research. And here's something that I don't have the answer to, but go ahead and think about this. Our qualitative research pulled out hope, or the lack of it, hopelessness, as a consistent theme, as why they, or how they may feel about their self-discrepancy, or why they may or may not feel negative feelings. But in our quantitative analysis, hope was not significant. The p-value was 0.29. So there was a 70% chance of a or I should say a 30% chance of a type 1 error, so we can't accept it. So why is that? I don't know. There are some things to consider. Qualitative analyses are weak because they're biased. You deal with the bias of the researchers who are behind it. So our group could have been biased. That could have been one thing. But that is an interesting discrepancy, and that's something we have to work through it and figure that out. Because of the inherent limitations of qualitative analyses and thematic analysis, it's important to basically support any finding that you get qualitatively with quantitative research. Because qualitative research is really good with building hypotheses and supporting theories, but you need to do a quantitative study to deductively support that. So what was really interesting to me was this concept of self-compassion and its opposite, which would be self-criticism. And self-compassion could also encompass other attributes that were mentioned here, like acceptance. So I was particularly interested in that, which leads us to part 3 of this whole process, which is the quantitative analysis of self-compassion. And you may have seen this gem, this flyer here. And if you participated in this, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Because that was, it was really important to us. I'll say that. I looked at the same variables as before, but only one moderator, which was self-compassion, and its different facets, different parts of self-compassion. And I used snowball sampling this time, which means I asked people who asked people who asked people. So we sent out a text that looked something like this. We asked them to send it to at least 5 people, and then we asked them to ask the people to whom they sent the link to send it to 5 more people, and so on and so on. And the hope was to get a large sample that way. And yeah, that's how we did that. Here are the results, and I'll fly through this part because we don't need to go any further than that. Sample size was 203. A median age was 23. I got rid of the age problem. I learned from my first mistake, so I got rid of the 31 plus option. Plus, we expanded our population so that we could get as many people recruited as we could. So we did not just recruit college students. We recruited anybody who could breathe and speak English. So we had to make sure that we accounted for that by allowing for a wider option of selection of ages that they could choose from. 68% were female, 92% were white, 93% non-Hispanic. So again, this is a weird population. 60% were never married and 35% married. And then the remaining 5% would be those who would select other things like divorced or things like that. The majority were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And self-compassion and all of its facets did not moderate the relationship between self-discrepancy and negative affect and perceived stress. So once again, I did not find what I was looking for, and that's always discouraging. But on the flip side, there are some interesting correlations that you may be interested in. And I would encourage you to pause the video and just look through this and see what we found. So, for example, and I'll list a few. Self-compassion was extremely correlated with negative affect and perceived stress. So self-compassion had a negative 0.6 correlation with negative affect and a negative 0.56 with perceived stress. The other variables that I've looked at in my research experience, like gratitude and mindfulness, they were correlated with negative affect and perceived stress, but not nearly as much as self-compassion. They were correlated maybe like 0.3 or 0.2. Yeah, I think that's what it was. But self-compassion was way up there, which is very interesting. So it speaks to the power of self-compassion. And there's some other things that you may be interested in seeing here. Also notable to mention is that ought self-discrepancy this time did significantly correlate with perceived stress and negative affect, whereas the first time it didn't. But remember how I said that there was a high likelihood of a type 2 error, meaning a missed opportunity before? Here, I had a larger sample. I had probably 80 more people. And when I had a larger sample, I had more power to detect the effect. And it was true that I had made a type 2 error before, because here there was a significant correlation between ought self-discrepancy and perceived stress and negative affect. And by the way, when I say significant correlation or significant finding, really what I'm saying is that the p-value is below 0.05. So there's a only 5% chance or less of getting a type 1 error. That's what we mean when we say a significant finding. So I would encourage you to pause the video and just scan through this because they're interesting findings. Another thing that is a work in progress, but I want to mention, we did exploratory analyses of the ought and ideal word lists. So we did this for the first part, the very first run. But for this third part, the self-compassion part that we did, we're still working on that. That's currently in process as we speak. But I wanted to put here what we got for the first part because they're interesting findings. So if you remember, for the integrated self-discrepancy index, people had to put 5 words that they thought described their ought self and 5 words that they thought described their ideal self. And these are the 6 most common words that were chosen. For the ought self, kind, honest, smart, forgiving, trustworthy, and hardworking. And for the ideal self, confident, intelligent, kind, motivated, selfless, and happy. And there's a lot of interesting questions that arise from this and different hypotheses that I'd want to test later on. But something that's very interesting to me is why kindness is so high on the ought list, but it's lower on the ideal list. That's a very intriguing finding for me. So I would encourage you to pause the video and look through these and do you find any patterns, or do you find anything that surprises you? Also, I just thought of this, but I like the idea. If you as you look through this, if you think of something that would be interesting to study regarding this, shoot me an email and send me your ideas. Yeah, there's interesting implications that can be drawn from that. So, a few last minute questions, and these would be something I'm not going to answer, but I would encourage you to pause the video and think about. Actually, just kidding. I'll answer the first one, but pause the video and think about the other ones. What kind of study was this? This is a cross-sectional study. It's also an association study with the correlations. It also can be considered a frequency study, especially if you consider how these are just frequency counts that we used right here. So that would be the kind of study that this was. Because it's correlational, because it's association, you cannot draw causal conclusions. The famous line that's probably been repeated over and over again in your class is correlation does not equal causation. So yes, you can't draw causal conclusions from a correlational study like this. Frankly, there weren't really positive findings to draw causal conclusions from, but there you go. So think about this. Describe the external validity. How externally valid was my study? Go ahead and think about that for a minute. And I'd also encourage you to think about the strengths and the limitations that you saw as I went through. What strengths did I have in this study? What limitations were there? There are always limitations in research. So there are some. If you can't think of them, think harder because they're there. And that's what I got. We put it all together. We hit most of the major things you've gone over in this class, with the exception of, I think, internal validity. Internal validity matters more for experiments, for randomized controlled trials. This wasn't an experiment, so internal validity isn't as much of a concern. So that's something we missed here. But for the most part, we hit a lot of different things that you've been talking about in class. So hopefully this helps you put it in practice and see what it looks like in a more practical sense. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to me through email or email Dr. Allison.